and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, a group of hackers have revealed that some top U.S. athletes took controlled substances ahead of this year's Olympics. The U.S. blamed Moscow for the leak. People are starting to wonder, is the Olympic doping scandal really more about politics than it is about sports? International leaders wrap up the 11th G20 summit earlier in Hangzhou this month. The talks ended with a number of far-reaching goals. Earlier asked our panelists, will the international platforms like the G20 play a bigger role in governing the world in the future? And do we really want them to? Hello and welcome to World Insight on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. Russia's doping scandal cast a long shadow over this year's Rio Olympics. Most Russian athletes were banned from participating in the Games after Western reporters leaked evidence they took performance-enhancing drugs. Now, a group of hackers, some say possibly from Russia, has revealed that top U.S. athletes also tested positive for controlled substances. Moscow has denied the U.S. accusation, said it was involved in the cyber attack. While the International Olympic Committee and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency have condemned the leak, is the issue of doping turning the Olympics into a political game? And who gets to decide what is a medicine and what is an illegal drug? Our panelists will tell us what they think. But first, this story.
Competing in Rio. The 2016 Paralympic Games is underway, but one team is missing this year. The Russian team was barred from participating in this year's Paralympics after the World Anti-Doping Agency discovered Russian officials sponsored a statewide doping system. Russia has responded to the ban by holding its own Paralympics in Moscow.
Of course, we are very sad that we are not competing in Rio. But we have thought through this issue. We are treating this competition the same way we would treat the Paralympic Games. We have been preparing for so many years, with so much training and effort.
Earlier this week, the hacking group Tsar Team, also known as Fancy Bear, revealed confidential medical data which proves that a number of U.S. athletes, including tennis sisters Serena and Venus Williams, also tested positive for controlled substances ahead of the Games. More data was released later about other athletes from other countries. WADA has accused Russia of helping the group conduct the leak, but Moscow has denied any involvement.
How can you prove that they are hackers?
How can you prove that they are hackers from Russia? You blame Russia for everything. It's ridiculous. I don't know. I don't have this information. We're also concerned because they also have data about our Russian athletes, and we could also become a victim. All athletes are at risk.
The recent medical leak relates to therapeutic use exemptions that enable athletes to take banned substances if they are sick. For example, U.S. gold medalist Simone Biles was allowed to take amphetamines. She defended herself on Twitter after the leak.
Sport should be clean and should look clean. And the real thing is we have an anti-doping program that we believe on it. What happened is terrible news, but at the same time we cannot believe and we cannot follow the things that are outside about our anti-doping program.
The line between therapeutic medicine and illegal doping is far from clear. Russia's Paralympic ban and the recent cyber attacks on U.S. athletes has many people wondering, is all the fuss about doping really about sports or politics?
And for more on the medical leaks and Russia's doping ban, we are joined here in our Beijing studio, Mr. Yan Qiang, our sports commentator and also founder of Score Sport. Welcome to our program. Also in the Beijing studio, Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University and former Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Houston Chronicle. Welcome, sir. Joining us from Moscow, Mr. Dmitry Barbish, political analyst from Sputnik International News Agency in Russia. Welcome as well. First of all, I really need to have your response, Mr. Barbish, coming from Russia, about the leak, the specific accusations, and the Russian government's denial of any Russian involvement in the so-called hacking?
Well, I think that the fury in the Western media about this leak is somewhat misguided, because the information was genuine. The names of the American athletes who used prohibited substances on WADA's permission, these names were made public, Simone Biles and others. With Russia, the story was very different. For example, the Russian Paralympians, the disabled athletes who were barred collectively from going to Rio, this was based on unconfirmed report by the WADA, by the World Anti-Doping Agency, because WADA said that they had 35 cases when there were irregularities with the Russian Paralympians anti-doping tests, but they never gave any names. So we don't even know which of the Russian Paralympians were accused of using the doping. And as a result, all 200 Russian disabled athletes were unable to go to Rio. So not only it was a collective punishment, it was also a punishment without any proof.
I think Mr.
So
Barbish,
that's why Russia is so angry, and that's why
Barbish,
it is in fact irrelevant.
Well, Mr. Barbish, you answer my question in a way, give me double substance. One is your response to the story itself. The other is why Russia was being punished without a real reasoning. It seems that is your argument. So let me go to you, Mr. Dunham. Even though you're coming from the United States, but you're a journalist. So let me ask you, both WADA and the US ADA has already condemned the so-called hacking. Of course, Kremlin has denied any Russian involvement in the hacking. And yet, we have seen some US athletes seem to apparently have some problems.
Well, there are multiple issues there. First, it's laughable to say there's no Russian involvement. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Why is that?
Because it's the group that did the hacking is Russian. Now you
How
could
did
say
you know that?
Who claim credit
Well,
for it.
who
The
claim?
Bears.
Would you trust anyone who's doing the hacking, claim themselves to be whom, and therefore trust them?
Yes, if Al Qaeda claims that it ran the planes into
Is it
the
comparable?
World Trade Center, no, obviously, no. But again, we're having the wrong discussion here.
What is the right
Okay,
discussion to you?
The right discussion is two issues. One is the pervasive doping that's been going on with Russian athletes, and the question of whether collective punishment is fair or not. I mean, there's pervasive doping going on in Russia, no question. But the question is, should every Paralympic athlete be forbidden? That's a good question.
What about the U.S. athletes? I think that is the attention right now.
The second question is WADA and the secrecy there, and the question of, I mean, obviously it's violation of secrecy, but it's accurate information. No question it's accurate information.
WADA has confirmed
and then
about
we
the
have
information.
I think we could have a good debate here instead of arguing about who did it or the motives.
One of the things
let's have a good debate on what is acceptable doping and what is unacceptable doping.
Okay, Mr. Dunham, if I could just follow you by fairly asking, I think from the third person's perspective, why, when it comes to the Russian athletes, they're immediately banned? Right. And why, when it comes to American athletes, then let's have a debate.
I'm not saying that the Russian athletes should have been banned.
All right, I mean, that's an interesting.
Because that's collective punishment. I think that's wrong.
All right, let me go to you, Mr. Yan. What about these athletes? I mean, even revealed by the hacking materials. WADA at this time have already confirmed that the revealed materials are real, and yet they have condemned the hacking. But let me ask you about the content of the revealed documents or hacked documents. About the Williams sisters. The documents have shown they have taken substances that are supposed to be falling into the category of quote-unquote doping. And yet the documents hacked also revealed on the same page that they have given special permission by the International Tennis Federation, which should be where they come from. However, when it comes to other athletes, also coming from the US,
Simone Biles,
for example, their specific documents did not indicate any special permission being given by the sports federation that he or she belong to.
Yeah.
And yet that category, according to the latest news reports, also confirmed by WADA, only named confidential.
Yeah, I think I cannot
answer. How should we
you.
understand
Nobody
this?
can answer this
Nobody
question.
can answer that. Why
only
is that?
WADA, only WADA itself could answer you this question. And WADA never disclosed its whole working process. You know, they're using the top secrecy, you know, or they have to keep everything confidential. But this kind of confidential situation is also something which really mystifies everybody. You know, it seems WADA is a warrior with the only sword and axes, you know, they could chop anyone, any head. But what's the regulation? What's the discipline behind this? You know, this really, you know,
who is scrutinizing their
I think that's
work.
exactly what infuriates, you know, our Russian sports people or our Russian government there. You know, the Fancy Bear group should be a kind of Russian, you know, hacking group. You know, there might not be too much doubt about that. But, you know, they disclosed this kind of confidential stuff. And what is procedure of WADA? Why could WADA, you know, ban these Russian athletes but not the others? I'm not mentioning only Simone Biles, but there must be other names involved. Now it's time for WADA to come forward and to disclose its own working process.
Interesting. Let me go back to you, Mr. Barbish. Is that what you want? I mean, from a sports commentator's perspective in Russia, is that what you want, for WADA to come out and clarify the working procedures and why some sports people are being put in this category, being banned, while others are not necessarily so? Even apparently, they seem to also have a doping problem with or without permissions.
Well, I think it's not just Russia that wants it, but international sports wants it. You know, many countries want it because, okay, this year it was done with Russia, the collective punishment, the double standard. Next year it can be done with China, with India, with any other country that the United States, Canada and Britain do not like. And the United States, Canada and Britain have dominating positions in WADA. Just look at the people who are at the top inside the WADA. So I agree with our American colleague that the question of collective punishment should be discussed. And the answer to this question is very simple. There should be no collective punishment. Since the times of Roman law, collective punishment is not practiced in civilized countries. And I think, I didn't say that I have proof that Russia was not involved in hacking. I think it could be done by groups not only from Russia, but it could be done by journalists, it could be done by civil activists, not necessarily from Russia, maybe from other countries. The main question is not who hacked WADA. The main question is it the truth or not?
Okay.
Let me remind you that during the Watergate scandal, some of the information used against Nixon was obtained by not very honest means by the journalists. But that was not the question discussed during Mr. Nixon's dismissal. The question discussed was, were these facts true or not?
Okay.
The facts on American athletes were true.
Got your point.
And it's very strange that the American athletes...
I have got your point, Mr. Barbish. I got your point 3 times. All right, let me ask you, Mr. Denham. I don't see you as just coming from Americans' perspective, but rather from a journalist's perspective. It is not just WADA, which is the drug testing agency that is responsible for the overall procedure, but also the sports federations.
Exactly.
Because the sports federations, they are the ones giving permission or denial to an athlete whether they could take certain kinds of drugs that are falling into the doping categories. So who is scrutinizing their work? Whether they are International Basketball Association,
that's a problem,
or tennis,
so super international organizations,
or wrestling, whether they are chairman is Russian or American or others, who are scrutinizing their job, and why would they give permission or not to certain athletes?
Well, each sport has its own oversight body,
right.
And they are controlled by cliques within. I mean, you saw in FIFA with football, real scandal. I mean, major scandals having to do with World Cup and everything else. But
Gymnastics, track and field?
there is not. I mean, the problem is they all are little kingdoms, and they all are run by people who are not very open, and we don't have a lot of transparency there. And they can give these waivers, and they can also give punishments.
Right.
I mean, go to Lance Armstrong. I mean, a major violator of doping, and his punishment was not by the World Anti-Doping; it was by the cycling people.
But the cycling people also covered it up, you know.
Right, exactly.
For so
And that's
many
the problem.
years.
This is
Being
the
bullied
thing,
by
Mr.
himself.
Yan,
Right.
because you have been working in the sports field for such a long time. I know you are a very devoted sports fan, but at the same time, I should also ask you, how much scrutiny should we give to modern sports these days, especially professional modern sports these days, because it is so much linked to the benefits, to the money.
Are we talking about
to the
China or
business?
internationally? I could start from
Both.
China. You know, I mean, you know, for the past 20 years, China has been very strict in all this anti-doping process. Even though, you know, before the Rio Olympics, I think in the Beijing office of anti-doping being closed by WADA. I don't know what's the reason behind that, but China has been very consistent in this process. But anyhow, you know, there are still, because of different you know, benefits or different background, there were still all kinds of cases of doping coming out. The problem in the overall structure internationally, I would say, you know, for the oversight bodies, especially like FIFA, you know, IAAF, you know, there are not exactly any other organizations which are scrutinizing them, and that's, we should add a WADA into that. You know, who is observing WADA? You know, what if WADA itself is not clean or right enough? Then what will be? You know, we are living in a very, very confused world, I would say.
Well, if everybody is confused, if everybody quote unquote is evil, does that make the whole thing right?
Evil plus evil, you know, it makes them more
Well,
evil.
I don't want to go into conspiracy theories, but I think this is a legitimate question to ask Mr. Barbich. From your perspective, what is the relations between doping and modern sports that we have witnessed these years? We see the prosperity of modern sports through the Olympic campaigns, through various kinds of professional sports, but there has been a confusion from this year's Olympics particularly. How much should we believe about the achievements of sports, and how much really it is linked to the doping issues that we have been so much concerned of over the past few years? Mr. Barbich.
Well, I think that certainly big money is killing sport, because when you have tens of millions of dollars depending on just one wrong move, then of course you have a lot of dirty games around it. It's natural. So from the beginning of the Olympic movement, one of the goals which its founders set for themselves was to protect the Olympic movement from big money and from big politics. And the world has been pretty successful in that until 1980, when for the first time the Moscow Olympic Games was boycotted by the United States and their allies for political reasons. Then the Soviet Union reciprocated very stupidly in 1984, boycotting the Los Angeles Games. Now we had this whole campaign against the Olympic Games in Sochi, waged by the Western media. So we have big politics and big money attacking sports. I think it should be up to the whole world to protect the sports from this attack. How can we do it? Only by applying some very rigorous standards. If WADA accuses certain athletes of doping, it should produce evidence. Just like in any court, just like in any normal justice system, you cannot disqualify people without producing any evidence. And of course, you cannot disqualify people collectively. So we have seen it this year. Unfortunately, this year was terrible for the Olympic movement. It happened that Russia was the victim. Next year, the victim can be China or any other country.
You've been given that warning from the very beginning, Mr. Barbich. So let me come back to you, Mr. Yan. What do you think? How much shall we believe in the achievements of the modern sports? What has been its relations, and should be its relations, to, let's just say, the improvements of the medication? Or how should we understand its relations with doping throughout the history?
There's another question that I cannot answer.
Yes.
You know, we're coming on a kind of boundary. You know, we cannot stay extremely clean, saying this is all natural, or it has no involvement of modern science, of modern medical, assistance. It's a question that we cannot answer. I know maybe WADA could give us a great example, but we're entering a vast grey area. It's impossible. It's really important. It's challenging on a foundation of the Olympic spirit.
There seems to be.
I really want to know, Rick, what's your view on this question?
I say athletes have pushed the bounds of what is legal, what is medically acceptable, and then you've also had widespread doping. East Germany is the best example, going back to the 1970s and 80s. But I mean, in this case, you do have a scandal in Russia. President Putin has condemned the people who were involved in the doping there. So I don't think there's a debate of whether there's doping in Russia. There's a debate over what the punishment should be, and I think that's what we really should be talking about here.
And the last question I should have, I think Mr. Barbish already given the answer, but I will give him a chance also for the final words. But before we go, I do want to ask the both of you. Mr. Dunham, what should be the relations between sports and politics? Some say it should be no relationship between these two, but we are living in the real world, so how should we understand this?
Well, my grandfather was a philosopher, and he would say there shouldn't be a relationship. There's no way to do that. There is a relationship. There was during the Cold War, where U.S. judges gave bad marks to the Soviets. Soviet judges did to the U.S. Right. We should just try to keep it at a minimum. And politics will always be there, but I think it is the financial mismanagement that's a deep problem.
Now it is the problem. Mr. Yan, 30 seconds for you.
We have to accept, we are living in a realistic world. Politics and sports could never be really detached. We have just to give more independence to sports, especially to sports people.
Very important. Mr. Barbish, we got only 20 seconds left for you, sir. So would you? Final words.
Okay. Well, I believe that sports can be saved by the solidarity of athletes. In the old times, politicians argued, but athletes were together. So this time, the saddest thing is that American and British athletes called for the collective punishment of Russian athletes. This thing should not be repeated again. Never repeat it again.
I see. Thank you so much for the three of you. Dmitry Barbish coming from Moscow in Russia for us, Rick Dunham originally from the U.S., and Yan Qiang here in Beijing with us. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for the three of you, for your own perspective and insights. Thank you. Stay with us here on World Insight, coming up in our final segment. The United Nations is preparing to select a new Secretary General later this month. I asked my panelists earlier, what role should international institutions like the UN and also international platforms like the G20 play in leading the world? The United Nations will select a new Secretary General next month from a pool of applicants from around the world. International groups like the UN and international platforms like the G20 have called for more global governance. And G20 leaders agreed to develop global governance institutions further. Earlier, I asked our panelists what role they think international institutions should have in leading the world. But first, this story.
At the end of 2016, the world's largest international organization will welcome a new chief. Current Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will step down after the UN General Assembly approves his replacement next month. Ban's successor is sure to continue efforts to realize the UN's vision of a more prosperous and harmonious world. Member states adopted the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda last year. Under the plan, countries will work together to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. Each agenda goal has specific targets that countries should achieve over the next 15 years. They include addressing poverty and hunger, improving access to education, making energy cleaner and more affordable, improving infrastructure and reducing inequality, while boosting innovation and economic growth. But many critics question the UN's ability to unite the world's nations together to achieve all of its far-reaching goals. Issues like global inequality will be especially hard to resolve. Experts point out that the GDP growth in many developing countries has only led to a broadening of the gap between the world's most affluent and its most destitute. Therefore, some play hope on other intergovernmental groups, such as the G7 and the G20, hoping more gathering of world leaders can bring more consensus on addressing current issues such as migrant crisis, climate change and regional instability. Globalization supporters expect platforms like the UN and the G20 to play a bigger role in tackling international issues in the future.
For more on the international governance issue after the G20, we are joined in Warsaw, Poland, Professor Bogdan Goracik, who is a professor and also director of the Center for Europe at the University of Warsaw, and in the UK, the United Kingdom. We are joined in London by Mr. Max Lawson, Oxfam GB's head of global policy and campaigns. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. How should we understand at this critical juncture the role of international governance? What do you think is the most important issue to work on from now on? Professor Goracik.
Well, as we know, G20 was a proper idea inaugurated in November 2008 to combine developed countries and developing countries, which emerged pretty soon as the emerging markets. And as we observe what's going on right now, we have dire straits around the globe because in the western part of the world we have new phenomena. The most meaningful, definitely, is the migrant challenge. This leads us to the question, who will lead? If you take into consideration that United Nations, which is the institutional framework to govern for the global governance, it was perfect in 1945, but definitely is not perfect for the challenges of 2016. So it seems that maybe this new directorate or board of governors like G20 is a proper solution, at least in economic and financial sense.
Professor Goracik asked a great question. That is, who will play the leading role?
At Oxfam, we think that the G20 has the potential to play a leading role. And we saw in London, just after the financial crisis, significant progress from the G20. They made some really dramatic steps in terms of global fiscal stimulus, in terms of helping the poorest nations. Since then, the G20 has been a real disappointment. In fact, we'd like to say the G20 is more of a G0 because you've got no one really doing anything dramatic to tackle the major issues of the day, and particularly the inequality crisis. That's a problem for almost every G20 nation, where the gap between the super rich and everybody else is growing dramatically, which has an impact on economic efficiency and economic growth, and is leaving millions of people behind, which is behind the populism of Donald Trump. Here in the UK, many of the people who voted to leave the EU also feeling very much left behind by the global economy.
Yeah, if I understand right, you are still proposing governments. Governments is the key players that's likely to help us solve the problems. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's a governance issue, it's a leadership issue. It's also an issue of turning away from the economics of today and looking for an economics that's benefiting ordinary people.
Professor Goracik, very briefly from you, of course, this time we see China as the host of the G20 summit. It put a lot of efforts into the preparations, consultations with everybody, but that does not necessarily going to guarantee the future G20 summits and meetings going to be run in the same way. So, Professor Goracik, what do you make of the future of G20?
G20 has a capacity. It's more than 85% of the global GDP, more than 80% of the global trade, more than 70% of inbound investment. So this is the largest community, the largest institution we created. And now when we have some problems in the western part of the world, inequality challenges, so the growth of China is definitely meaningful. The Chinese Silk roads are in proper direction, because we need to have immediate connection. The problem is right now, to my mind, first, inequality, so sustainable development is one of the solutions. Second, we need to have interconnectivity due to the fact that the climate change is already visible on our very own eyes. It is visible everywhere. The same story with environment. The G20 took place in Hangzhou, which is a symbol of environment, and your Western Lake and the gardens in the neighborhood. This is a challenge of all humankind. Doesn't matter if you are American, Chinese, or Polish in this sense. So we have global challenges, and we need to have a global attitude, global cooperation. It doesn't matter if you are from developing world or developed world, because the challenges are the same for all humankind.
Mr. Lawson, though, we have to be a little bit realistic. Will the kind of worldly outlook Professor Garagic proposed, which certainly is urgently needed, will that become a reality given what we have with the economies and also the current geopolitics?
I think it's very unlikely. I think it's possible. I think with the potential of German leadership of the G20 next year, we could see action, but mainly on these issues where there's economic self-interest. So to take one example, the global problem of tax evasion and tax avoidance by corporations and rich individuals is a problem for the majority of G20 countries. So that would be an action to clamp down on tax avoidance and tax evasion. They're already taking steps in that direction, but they could go much further, and that would make a big difference in terms of the fight against inequality and to deliver the kind of growth that benefits ordinary people.
Yes, indeed. On the other hand, we talk so abstractly over the past few days about international governance. But in your minds, gentlemen, who are the one and what issues should be really on the top of the agenda? We really need to find some on the top of the agenda to deal with it first, to gain the lower hanging fruit, to make everybody becoming more confident, to make sure people understand where we're going. Therefore, we can have some result. So, Mr. Lawson, if I ask you to give us a story, give us one person, give us one issue that you think has to be head-on dealt with.
Inequality has grown dramatically in almost every G20 country, but also in some of the poorest countries. I've lived and worked in Africa for Oxfam, and you're seeing a situation in a country like Zambia where they've had 6% growth for 10 years, but there are more poor people now, more people living on less than $2 a day than there were at the beginning of that process. So economic growth is leaving people behind, particularly in some of the poorest countries. For me, the story is about a different economic model and something that really benefits everybody and not just those at the very top.
Professor Garagic, what about you? One person, one aspect you think is really going to help out find the threads of solutions?
One person, difficult to say, but one point, I share the view that global inequality is the issue on the global agenda starting from the US, but it is within the states, among the states, and among the continents. We here in Europe, we have a problem with the refugees and migrants, which is also the structural process, which means that Europe is an affluent society, and we have immediate neighborhood, meaning North Africa, not only the Middle East, which is in different kind of reality. So inequality is point number one. Point number two, innovation is absolutely necessary because we have global challenges starting from climate change, and here we need to have more and more, not fossil fuels, but alternative energy sources in all dimensions. Here, China is already a leader, European Union is doing well, but the others need to be try to follow our footsteps.
Both of your answers, gentlemen, really reminded me of one crucial issue, that is It is not true that we don't have solutions. It's whether those solutions will be tapped in by the political leaders, by our current international governance systems, to make sure we're going to have some good results.
I think ensuring that politicians do what they say they're going to do and take leadership is probably the most difficult issue of our age. But I do think that the role of civil society around the world, organisations like Oxfam and others, in pointing out the tremendous problems of the day and holding the G20 to account, calling on them to act and following up on promises that they've made, is a key way of ensuring that they do what they've said. So I think there's a pivotal role for social movements, trade unions, civil society around the world in scrutinising the actions of politicians and not letting them get away with doing nothing.
But if I could, Mr. Lawson, follow up, some of the part of the civil society, some parts of the NGOs, some parts of, let's just say, trade unions, according to many, are not necessarily moving things forward, but rather becoming obstacles for international trade and barriers. So what do you make of many of the solutions and sources of solution you mentioned, and their role now?
Civil society would agree that extreme inequality is a major obstacle that faces the world. I think they would also agree that combating climate change is absolutely vital. I think they speak broadly with one voice on that, and they're demanding greater action from their governments, as we saw in Paris at the climate change conference, and we're seeing on the issue of taxation with the G20. I don't see a big division between civil society organisations. I see a quite united voice that we mustn't let the rich pay no taxes, and we must fix the problem of climate change.
Professor Gorashik.
I have a little bit different opinion. I share the view that civil society and grassroots level organization is important, but to my mind what is really necessary for the time being is definitely a strong leadership and vision for the global affairs. Please take into consideration that after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, there was no Vienna Congress or Treaty of Versailles. In legal terms, we have a global disorder. We are out of control, so sorry to say. So I would vote for strong leadership, a vision, and maybe some kind of new global solution, which means new Vienna Congress or new Treaty of Versailles, because in constitutional and institutional and legal terms, we are out of order, sorry to say so.
All right, and we see there are so many different kinds of layers, international organizations, different kinds of platforms, be it worldly or regionally, even bilateral, trilaterally. How should we understand this ever intertwined web? Are they going against one another, or how can we make sure that they are going to work together? What do you think is the critical elements here?
Oh, I think leadership is key. I would agree with that. I think, yes, there are many different institutions out there, but the G20 is potentially by far the most powerful in terms of economic clout. And if they agree to do something, then all the others will follow them. So if the G20 really wanted to end the problem of tax havens, the problem of rich people hiding their wealth, then they could easily do that. They have the power and they have the influence to clamp down on this problem, which is driving inequality across the world. So I think we mustn't underestimate the power of those 20 countries when they decide to do something together.
I see.
As they did in 2009 in London, we saw considerable active effort by the G20, which made a very big difference to a lot of people's lives. So they can do it when they want to.
Max Lawson, Bogdan Gorashik, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the program, visit our website. Just type in World Inside CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Thank you so much.